I tend to think that writers shouldn't have these kind of national descriptors attached to them. And the more so that those kinds of descriptors shouldn't be attached to the work. Because I, not so long ago, gave a speech in Berlin called African Literature Doesn't Exist, suggesting that the practice of classifying writers based on where in the world they come from is past its prime at best. I say this because what should where somebody comes from have to do with what they write? Fundamentally, my being from wherever I'm from, Ghana, Nigeria, living in Rome, growing up in the States, being born in England, makes me sort of interesting at a cocktail party, but it doesn't necessarily change what I write or about whom I write. And so I would suggest that the difficulty that people have categorizing me as a writer is a good thing, because I think it calls into question why we undertake this kind of categorization at all. I like the question. I tend to think that I write in my English, the English of Taiye Selasi, and that English is a language informed by all the places in the world in which I speak it. So I was born in England, and my mom speaks with a very strong British accent. She very much so speaks and taught my twin and me British English. But then, of course, I was educated in the States and then again back in England. So I certainly speak a credible version of American English as well. Also, though, Nigeria and Ghana, the countries that my parents come from, are Anglophone countries. They were colonized by Great Britain, and so we have our own version of English also there, different in Nigeria than in Ghana, but certainly I'm one who believes that English is an African language, that English is an Indian language as well as a Western one. And so my English is a ensemble of the different Englishes with which I grew up speaking. It is British, it is American, there is something distinctly West African in places, certainly to do with the meter and the rhythm. And then there's something that I call a whole greater than the sum of its parts. There's something that in all of this mélange is mine because I come from these different places. And that's the thing that I think is hardest to describe and yet easiest to sense in the text. Bye Bye Babar, or What is an Afropolitaine, is an essay that I wrote almost 10 years ago now, considering the difficulty that I have answering the question, where are you from? So I was joking with my editor on the way here that when she's asked, well, where is Taiye Selasi from? She has a hard time answering the question. And so you can imagine the difficulty that I face. About 10 years ago, I was curious to know, to explore whether there were other people who had this problem. Not just African people born outside of Africa, but African people born within Africa as well. My dear friends who are living in Accra right now are living in a very different Ghana than the one my father was born in. Not least because my father was born in Gold Coast, a colony that got its independence in 1957, well after he was born. And not least because my friends, and when I am there, I am living in a 21st century nation state that is completely evolving year after year. And so this idea of national identity, it occurred to me in the context of those of us who come from African countries, but also Asian and South American. There are corollaries. The project of defining who we are on the basis of national identity is really complicated and perhaps misguided in certain cases. And so in that essay, I was thinking about self-identity. I was thinking about the instability of national identity, and I was thinking about the kind of hybrid identity that often emerges from the kind of transnational experience that I and many like me have had. Absolutely. And there are certain words in Yoruba, certain words in Ewe in the text that are a bit in Ga, also that are a bit to translate them would have created a break, I think, in the forward motion of the story, and so I left them in the original language, and then assumed. I assume a lot of intelligence on the part of the reader, and I like when writers do the same for me. At the same time, language for me is music, and so what's most important to me when writing is that the prose flow, and I think I've rightly been accused of being sort of a poet in a novelist's clothing, and that's an accusation that I welcome. They are two separate questions: what made me write a novel and what made me write this novel. And then I suppose there's a third question, which is what makes you write. So we start with what makes me write. I don't know. I was absolutely born with this condition. I've loved to write. I've loved to read stories. I've loved to tell stories since I was a little girl. So I think of writing as a passion. But then there's the question, are you going to follow this passion as a hobby, or are you going to follow this passion as a profession? This is a question that I wrestled with for a very long time, because I come from a very high-achieving family in which more traditional professions are advised. Once you've made that decision that you want to write for a living, the questions become quite practical. It's difficult to live as a poet. It's less difficult, but still quite difficult, to live as a writer of short stories alone. I think that anybody who has decided to be a professional writer has to face the music eventually and say, okay, eventually I'm going to have to write a novel. And it's a joy, that obligation. I knew that I had to write a full-length work, and I was waiting for the story to come that would justify a full-length work. Because plots for me are easy. I love people, and I'm constantly visited by different narratives exploring their lives. But not all of those narratives justify 300 pages. This one was the first one, the first narrative, the first plot, the first assembly of characters that did. This is a very interesting point to do with structure. I tend to like writing that mimics the way the mind works, that mimics human experience itself. So we, as we sit here in the present moment, we, as our lives go en avant, as our lives go forward, we are constantly in a present moment, thinking back to a past moment or imagining what will happen in the future, only to then return to a present moment. So in the course of a single day, in the 24 hours that make up a day, we have actually been in at least 3 different time spaces, just waking up, between waking up and going to sleep. We have time traveled. And I think that my writing, I don't know if I made this decision consciously, but I certainly see it having done it. My writing mirrors that in a way. Somebody is standing in a garden, and the entirety of part 1 of the novel, in terms of forward motion, in terms of plot, is about 5 minutes long. But just as it's possible for me to spend the next 5 minutes both here and in my thoughts back in this morning, and also at some prior point, as well as imagining what's going to happen in the future, Kweku, the protagonist, certainly for part 1, does the same. And so that's something that I think is a kind of fundamental approach that I take to literature, that the reader should be able to experience the novel the way he or she experiences him or herself. In sort of, we've got a central point, and then we're constantly drifting forward and backwards from it. For short story, structure, I think, is of critical importance, because you've got such a little bit of time to tell the entire thing, which is, I think, the beauty of the form. And it's not true that a novel is just a longer short story. And I think what I found in writing the novel, and I love that you say that it's a novel written almost in the style of a short story, was that one could just keep going forward, but using this same structure again and again. So a moment lived in the present with memories from the past, and even a sort of premonition about the future, all, as you say, concentrated in a few pages. And just to keep doing this, a few pages at a time, a few pages at a time, a few pages at a time. This was both my this was the challenge I think that I set for myself, and it was the adventure of writing this book. Time for me is endlessly fascinating. Yeah. Time is perhaps it seems that the central theme of the novel is family or abandonment. But if I think about what my central project is as less as a novelist and more as an investigator of human experience, it's time. I'm endlessly fascinated by how we experience time and the fallacy of this view of life that says we are going forward. I'm not convinced. First of all, I'm honored by the comparison to Arundhati Roy. The God of Small Things is hands down one of my favorite books. I still remember the first time I read it, I just kept closing the book. There would be these moments when I was reading it, I would just, I would be completely breathless at the beauty of her prose. But it's funny, I met Arundhati in India a few years ago, in Jaipur, actually, in Jodhpur, sorry. And I asked her, I said, but who are the twins in your family? Because in your novel, you render the experience of being a twin so perfectly. I'm sure that either you are a twin or there are twins very close to you. And she said, no, there are no twins in my family. And I said, but how could you have written twins so well? I'm a twin, and I couldn't have done a more accurate job myself of describing my own experience. And I'll never forget, she said, but I'm a writer, that's what writers do. But of course, yeah. And so meeting Arundhati was sort of this life-changing moment for me. Reading her book first, and then many years later, meeting her. Because I think when I read the book, I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. But when I met her, it occurred to me that any good novelist should be able to write far beyond her experience. And to write Kweku, to write Fola, I mean, I've never been a parent, I've never been through half of the things that these characters have been through. And so it took a kind of courage to take on their stories and to feel that I could tell them with some kind of truth. And I think it was this conversation that I had with Arundhati that really emboldened me to take on this project. Twins for me, in quite apart from the fact that I am a twin, I'll come to that, but I think that twins are an incredible metaphor, generally speaking. I think that's why we find them in so many myths. That's why we find them in so many novels, especially boy-girl twins. There is something so fundamentally human about this idea of being together and then brought apart to then somehow find one's way back together. We are always in love, in family, in hope, being either twinned or untwinned. And so I think that's why twins work so well in literature, generally speaking. My experience being a twin has been a fascinating one, because obviously my sister and I are incredibly close. She's my best friend and more. We must have spent every single day of our lives together until the age of about 15 years old, and we come from exactly the same experiences, but live completely different lives. And so, yes, of course, this has been part of my own experience on Earth, this wonder at looking at someone who literally has the same genetic complement, but is completely different. What being a twin will teach you very quickly is how little where you come from and how you were raised has to do with how you turn out. If it did, my sister and I would be exactly the same, and we are not. You know, It's always hard to say what my novel is about. I certainly don't experience it as having a point or a series of points. For me, writing is always, first and foremost, an exercise in form. And it's interesting because I remember I once asked the novelist Toni Morrison, which is more important, form or content? I was afraid at that point, and I still sometimes am, that I paid too much attention to form to the exclusion of content, if you will. And her answer was so, it stays with me. She said, but form is content. And I think that in this book, if there is a point, it is the form of the book, and that has a kind of content unto itself. That having been said, this question of identity, ethnic identity, racial identity, color, belonging, exile, home, all of this is of endless fascination to me, because I think that, especially in the case of the immigrant, we make the mistake of believing that the fundamental angst, if you will, of the immigrant is simply not being home. But I ask myself, who is ever home? The Pakistani author Mohsin Hamid, he on this subject once said, but we're all time travelers, meaning even Mohsin, whose family is Pakistani, who grew up outside of Pakistan but is now back in Lahore raising his family there with his Pakistani wife, will never return to the Pakistan of his youth, much less the Pakistan of his parents' youth, much less the Pakistan which was once part of India. My father, who is from Ghana, of course feels at home in Ghana, but he spent 40 years in Saudi Arabia and will never return to the village of his youth because it's gone, it's simply not there. Finally, I think home is emotional. And if we are to feel home in the world, then it's because we have found a home within ourselves. We found a home within the people that we love. I think that is what Olu finds. He goes looking for this sense of belonging, first in achievement, first in overcoming the shame that he felt at the disappointment of his father's leaving. And he genuinely believes, as do many, that if he can just set everything up perfectly, then he'll be home. Only to find that none of that is what will give him a sense of belonging, that the love that he has for this woman is where he belongs. The same too for Kweku, for Fola, for Taiwo, for Kainde, and for Sadie in different ways. And I think if there's anything that I learned in writing this book, it was this, that the only home I have, but the only home we can have, is here. I think the last part of the book is called Go. We have le départ at the end, because when you have figured out that your home is inside you, then you can go anywhere knowing that you'll take it with you, that it will come to. This has certainly been the great lesson of my life. I spent perhaps the first half of my 30-something years on earth desperately seeking a place where I might feel some bedrock sense of belonging, only to discover in the next 15 or so years that that place wasn't to be found out there. And I traveled. I saw a lot of out there, and none of it reflected back to me some sense of self that made me feel known, welcome, and completely understood. But then I started talking to people, and I started to find that French people in France, Italian people in Italy, Ghanaian people in Ghana, and American people in America felt no more affirmed by their surroundings. This was just a fundamental realization, something that I think changed the course of my life. And I think it comes up again and again in the things that I write, perhaps in spite of myself, because it's something that is endlessly fascinating to me and ultimately redeeming for my characters. So, Ghana Must Go refers to an incident in 1983 when the Nigerian government expelled around 2 million Ghanaians who were living in Nigeria and sent them back to Ghana, giving them precious little time to go. In their haste, these exiled Ghanaians packed their things in these plaid plastic bags, often affectionately known as immigrant luggage. And because they were being kicked out, the bags themselves, the bags they carried, came to be known as Ghana Must Go bags or Ghana Go Home bags. When I started writing the novel, I didn't give it a name. And titles are funny. They usually sort of come to me and hold on and never let go. So I thought I would take my time because I knew once a title attached itself to the text, it would be really hard to shake it loose. But I was in my mum's house in Accra, in Ghana, when the title Ghana Must Go came, and I thought it was more of a feeling. I felt, yeah, that's it. And I said to my mum, I think I'm going to call my novel Ghana Must Go. And she said, that's a really controversial title. And I said, but why? It's just the name of the bag. And she said, yeah, but do you know how the bags got their name? And I didn't. And so she told me about what had happened in 1983 in Nigeria. And I was shocked. I thought, but why do we in Ghana use the name Ghana Must Go if it has this sort of derogatory backstory? And it made me think about how time works, how my generation in Ghana, I asked a number of friends, especially those who had been born and raised in Ghana, do you know why we call these Ghana Must Go bags? And many did not. And I thought, that's right. That's how time works. Something that was painful can be almost erased as by time, the way that water erodes rock. Not for everybody, but for some. And I just knew at that point that the title was going to stay, because it contained in this one bag all of the themes that interest me: time, identity, movement, coming and going, being kicked out, being allowed to return. All of it was there in that bag. The title in French echoes a lot of the foreign translations of the book. In auf Deutsch ist diese Dinge geschehen nicht einfach so. In Italiano, le bellezze delle cose fragili. I think the reason we have these different titles is quite simple. And in the beginning, the German title was changed first, and my editor said to me really simply, listen, we don't want to put the name Ghana in the title of the book because there is a fear that if the reader sees the word Ghana, they will instantly think that it's a book about Africa, which means stereotypically about famine or war, civil war, politics, and it's not. It's a novel about a family. When I first heard this, I admit I was a bit disappointed. I thought, is it still the case that a reader in Germany, a reader in France, a reader in Italy sees Ghana and immediately thinks political dysfunction? And I'm sad to say it is. I was shocked when the book was published in the English-speaking world by the insistence upon certain reviewers and journals, the insistence on reading it as a book about immigration or a book about the African immigrant, which to me it so clearly is not. Having had that experience, particularly in the States, I then was much more open to changing the title in other languages to something that would suggest the emotional core of the book. Le ravissement des innocents is just as good as Diese Dinge geschehen nicht einfach so, or La bellezza delle cose fragili, because it comes from the text itself, so in a sense my words but not my language, and it comes from the throbbing heartbeat of this story, and not from, as I say, this kind of lazy reading of the book as an immigrant text. There is near the end of the novel a particularly disturbing scene. But to be honest, when I first conceived of this entire narrative, this family, that scene was there. That truth was there. It was just always the case that this had happened, and that in its journey to discover itself, the family would uncover that this had happened. So for me, plots always feel a bit inevitable. This is true also for a short story I wrote, The Sex Lives of African Girls, which also has a very disturbing scene. I just accept the plot as a given in a way. It always feels like I'm writing about people who exist and things that have happened, and that to change them would be like trying to change history. There would be something dangerous, even disrespectful about it. The same thing happened with The Sex Lives of African Girls. I wrote that short story, narrowly focused as always on the poetry of it, on the rhythm, on the meter, on the lyric. And then I finished it and it was published. And then it went on into Best American Short Stories. And I remember I one day picked up the book, started reading the story. And I was with my sister because she walked by and she said, "Oh my gosh, what's wrong?" And I said, "What?" And she said, "You're crying." And I didn't even realize I was crying. They were just tears just streaming silently down my face. I said, "Yeah, Yatza, this story is so sad." And she just burst out laughing. She said, "Did you just figure that out right now?" And in a way I had just figured it out years after writing the story. I think I know why. I think for me, beautiful language, at least beautiful for me, can completely inoculate me. It's like going into a contaminated war zone, but in a hazmat suit. For me, poetry and beauty is my hazmat suit. If I have it on, I can walk through anything, no matter how apocalyptic, no matter how dark, no matter how heartbreaking. I don't feel it. And I can look at an ugly thing straight in the eye, and as long as I can find beautiful language with which to tell the truth of that ugliness, then the ugliness doesn't break my heart. Once the suit is off, time has passed. When I read the scene now, I find it incredibly difficult. But when I was writing it, no. When I was writing it, there was a momentum that I experienced because of the language that completely shielded me from the ugliness. And so it was a mystery to me in the beginning when people were so up in arms about this scene. And I would think, but it's actually quite beautiful. Like, what are they so upset about? I think it really moves because I could, in a way, only hear the music. And then, with the passage of time, I could hear not only the melody, but the words. I suppose we can start by asking what we mean by political. But I can say that for me, this exercise was formal. This exercise was to do with poetry and to what extent prose might, to use Francine Duplessis Gray's words, to what extent prose might approximate the conditions of poetry, whereby not a single syllable can be changed without affecting the entire page, she wrote. That was my project here. It was constantly to find the frontier between poetry and prose, and in so doing, to explore the truths of these 6 characters, mother, father, 4 children, and then the 7th character, the family itself. You are right to say that all literature, all art, to a certain extent, is political or can be engaged politically, because there are choices that we make. It is true that Olu is born to West African parents and Ling to Chinese immigrants. They are a couple, and perhaps a different writer might take a moment to comment on the fact that Ling is Asian and Olu is not. It is a decision not to comment on it, surely, in the same way that a filmmaker can focus in here and exclude this, or focus in here and exclude that, but is still shooting the space. Perhaps the Greek word that most resonates with me when I think about my politics is the word utopia. I ended this speech, African literature doesn't exist, suggesting that my view of how literature should be classified I wish that literature were classified as music is. We talk about classical music, jazz, pop, but we don't say African jazz or European jazz. I mean, it would be an insult to a good jazz player to say that you are a French jazz musician. You're a good one, or you're not. I wish literature were categorized this way. And when I proposed this to a friend, he said, yeah, but that's like how things work in your utopia. And later I was thinking about this word utopia, which in the Greek means no place. And I thought, yeah, but that is my utopia. If I could come from anywhere, it would be from no place. Because then we would take a text like this and we would have these 6 characters and the love and the shame and the hurt and the loss and the lust that they experience. And we would experience them as coming from no place. We would experience them as human beings. And the barrier of skin color, of ethnicity, of language would cease to exist. To me, coming from no place is utopic. And I think that's, if I have a politic, it comes from no place. It's the politics of nowhere. When I talk about the insistence in the American press to read this in that vein, I just laughed. I thought, that's really funny. That's exactly what should not be happening. And it happens benignly, I think, because people are not aware even of the limitations they are placing on the writer of African origin by insisting that anything you say or do or write or think must be about Africa and its problems. It's absurd. And it's condescending. But I am hopeful enough or optimistic enough to believe that it is pure ignorance. So not spiteful or malicious, but ignorant, done without awareness. And all I can do in the face of unawareness is try to bring awareness as calmly and as kindly as I can. Bless you for saying that. I when I was really young, I said to my mom, and she found this poem and she framed it for me so sweetly. I wrote this poem and it was published in the newspaper in Brookline, where I grew up, I think in 1990 or 1989. I was really young. And I wrote in this poem that my homeland is literature. And I thought, how did I know that at 9? And then spend the next 20 years trying to remember it.